Today I'm with Colleen Hardwick, who's running to be the mayor of Vancouver with a team for Livable Vancouver. Hi, Colleen.
Hi, Rohana.
Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, born in Vancouver, raised and educated here through our both elementary and secondary school system. I attended UBC, where my father taught urban geography for 37 years. I took geography and political science in my undergraduate degrees, and then I embarked on my master's in urban planning, did my planning practicum at the city of Victoria. And then one day they shot a movie in our house and I joined the film industry instead, but always kept involved with urban land use issues. And up until the sort of 2005 to 2008 period, I sat on the city's development permit board. In 2012, I was on the Mayor's Task Force on Housing Affordability. I was on the board of the Urbanarium up until such time as I ran for city council. And so and I forgot to mention I was 10 when my dad was first elected to city council. So I kind of grew up between UBC and the geography faculty and City Hall.
Okay, so why did you decide to run for mayor?
Because I didn't see anyone else that was running that understood what was wrong and had the chops to turn the ship around. Quite frankly, I recognized that the mayor was going to continue down the path that he was on, and he had to go. But the other people that were running lacked the background knowledge and experience. And so I felt that it was my responsibility to run in the interest of the future, because I don't want to be the last generation of my family that can afford to live in Vancouver.
So you have very strong views about the housing crisis in Vancouver. Can you tell us what it looks like for you?
Well, I've watched this all come down like everybody else. You know, when I was in university, I lived in basement suites all over town. And then as a single mother, I rented, I went from basement suites to townhouses to main floor of a house to houses, always trying to be in short walking distance to schools for the kids. And that used to be possible, but what we've seen really happen, particularly over the last 14 years since 2008 and the crash, which coincided with the election of Gregor Robertson and Vision, was a new business model at the City Hall that has just exacerbated the problem. And when I was trying to see what had happened earlier, before I got on council, it was impossible to look under the hood. You couldn't get line item budgets anymore, for example. But when I did get in, I tried to do a baseline review back to 2008 so I could understand, well, how did they double the budget? Where did the money come from? Where did the money go? Can I get line item detail, for example? I kept running into roadblocks. But what I eventually found was that in 2009, the city changed its financial model for the capital side of the budget. And because this is a conversation among people that understand a certain amount of complexity, I'll lay it out for you. Historically, capital has always been funded by debt. We have a plebiscite every election cycle to determine how much money we empower the city to borrow to build or repair infrastructure. So whether that's bridges or parks or community centers, it's always been funded through debenture borrowing. And then it gets paid off principal and interest on the operating side of the budget. And occasionally there would be site-specific revenue that would come in from other sources, could come in from the senior levels of government. But through the 90s, certainly, post-Expo, we saw money start to come in through developer contributions, including CACs or community amenity contributions. But according to Larry Beasley, the former director of planning, those were always on a location-specific basis. So Expo lands, Concord Pacific, you negotiate a CAC because we need a park or community center. But in 2009, this all changed, and they regularized developer contributions as a revenue stream in the capital budget. So that meant they built a business model about basically setting it up to sell rezoning to generate revenue, to take a piece of the action on every transaction. So, for example, you would take the Canby Corridor plan and look at that and say, okay, well, we anticipate that there will be, over this many blocks, there will be this many land assemblies that will go up this many stories, and every one of those transactions, we will take, you know, $1 million, 2 million, whatever the magic number was. So this all sounds great. The way that they packaged it and marketed it was, we're going to use growth to fund growth. But when you think about it, what happens when you rezone a piece of property? Even if you go from single family to duplex, July 1st, BC Assessment comes in, waves their magic wand, as a former head of real estate at the city said to me, and reassesses the property at highest and best use. And highest and best use, although it sounds very warm and fuzzy, really boils down to how much money can we extract from this piece of ground and the air above it. So what we saw after the summer of 2018, Rohanna, I think when you and I met was when the city rezoned all single family to duplex. We saw a spike in the 2019 numbers that came from BC Assessment. And when I went to BC Assessment and I asked them, can you please give us a profile of how much the land and the air above it has increased over the decade, we saw that go from 188 to 480 billion in 9 years, from 2010 to 2019. So this is a big problem, because if we're selling zoning to generate revenue, it's creating an inflationary spiral that will never make housing affordable by definition. And this is why I've pressed so hard to get housing data. And I can go on, but you probably want to get a word in edgewise.
So that's interesting. But at the same time, there's another school of thought that says that we need to get housing built, and that perhaps the only way to do it is to get the market developers interested. How do you feel about that?
Let's unpack it. First of all, when you do the rezoning, you're inflating land values by definition. And because we've seen such a huge volume of rezoning over the last decade plus, we've seen land values increase exponentially. So the bad news is inflationary spiral, but we can deal with that by slowing down the number of rezonings. But the good news is, because we've done so much rezoning, there's a boatload of existing zone capacity to grow into. So I've been trying to get those zone capacity numbers out of the city. Think of it this way. Imagine that you could put a big plexiglass box across the top of the city that shows what the height and massing could be under existing zoning. Well, if I'd been able to get the numbers out of the city, I had people that would have done that 3D modeling so that we could demonstrate it. But frankly, I've been stonewalled by staff in obtaining that data. But we know from the analysis that we have done that there is well over 100,000 units already approved in the pipeline at various stages, from approvals through shovels in the ground all the way through to occupancy. We've got loads of existing zone capacity. So if we want to create affordable housing, let's stop inflating land values. Let's slow down the rate. Let's build into the existing zone capacity. And then let's look at the costs of production. Because if you unpack it, you will see that approximately 25 to 30% of every unit cost is attributable to the city in one way, shape, or form. It's either in the time that it takes to go through the process, which is become way, double, triple, quadruple, 10 times longer to get anything through. Then there's the cost of the permits themselves. It used to be that a simple inquiry cost $400, and overnight it went up to $2,900. which is only understandable when you realize how many more mouths there are to feed when the city added 243 new full-time employees in a single year as they bifurcated and then doubled up the size of the planning department. And then finally, there's the building code itself. Vancouver has its own building code separate from the rest of the province, as you likely know. And I've heard it described as being Byzantine in its complexity. So in combination, the time that it takes, the cost of the permits and the building code, if that's adding 25% to the cost of a unit, so that's $250,000 out of every $1 million unit, then maybe we should be looking at trying to cut that down by half. Just saying. So these are the kinds of things that can be done. Now, on top of that, we do need to be looking at aligning our expectations with pace of change. And planning, of course, historically has considered pace of change as being a major factor in the balance, because good planning is about balance, right? And what we've seen is the notion that we need to be promoting growth, which is ultimately about profit, as opposed to managing growth, which is about livability. So when we talk about population growth, and this is something that I've spent a lot of time on, as you likely know, we've seen the city of Vancouver growing at a 1% per annum compounding basis. So in 2011, for example, because the census goes every 5 years, we hit 600,000. In 2016, we were up to 632, and 2021 up to 668. So 68,000 new residents divided by 2.2 individuals per dwelling unit nets down to about 32,000 new households, which aligns perfectly with Metro Vancouver's regional growth strategy attribution to the city of Vancouver proper. But contrast that to the city's Housing Vancouver strategy targets of 72,000 units. So how do you go from 32,000 to 72,000? What that means that in addition to the roughly 70,000 new residents that the city would reasonably expect over a decade, that there would be 100,000 more. And why? I mean, what would drive that kind of population growth? People go to most of our population growth is driven by immigration. 85% of population growth is driven by immigration. And it's always been that way in Canada, whether we were trying to get farmers to open the prairies back at the turn of the last century, or we were looking at people with skilled labor to help build out infrastructure. Canada has always looked to attract immigration according to different economic sectors. But we don't see anything here that would suggest anything why you would expect population growth to be more than double projections. Now, we know that the federal government has accelerated its population growth targets, but if the idea is if you build it, they will come, that's hardly an economic development strategy for the future. So, I've been reading, for example, Dan Bresnitz's book called Innovation in Real Places that talks about the future economy and the need to be fostering innovation and entrepreneurship to grow our future economy. But that's still going to be at a fairly steady state as we've gone from the terminus of the railway, the Western Port, based on natural resource extraction industries, forestry, fisheries, mining, now to where we are with the primary driver of the economy is real estate, housing production, and construction, which is fundamentally unsustainable and even cannibalistic in its nature. So the only reason that I can come up with to set targets that are more than double projections is to maximize profits for the big property developers.
So that's something that the critics say that the immigration targets are set by the federal government, and because of our charter, the cities have no rights to turn people away. So what people are saying is that, what your critics are saying is that the city has a responsibility to build to accommodate the new people who are coming into the city.
Okay,
How
so
do you
then I
respond to
would
that?
okay, so let's look at that. So even if there's 450,000 new people a year coming to Canada, those, the point is to be distributed across the country, not continuing to concentrate people into small urban areas such as the peninsula that is the city of Vancouver. Moreover, if you look at the regional growth strategy for all of Metro Vancouver, Vancouver has been taking on more than its fair share of housing density. Now, don't get me wrong, and I resent the implication that I am anti-growth. That's absolute malarkey. Change is the only constant, and growth is inevitable. It's a question about the pace of change and the ability to do so in a way that is livable. And livability is about balance of 5 key principles. If people do their homework and do a little bit of reading, they'll understand this. It's the balance between housing and density, mobility, how we get around, transit, commercial activity, economic development. Where do we shop? Where do we work? Community amenities, schools, parks, community centers, and then affordability. Because if we can't afford to live there, what's the point? So as we think about planning for the future, good planning, in my view, balances those key principles and thinks about how they can be affected. So if you look at the city of Vancouver, which is 115 square kilometers from Boundary Road to the University Endowment Lands, and based on the research that I've done, superimposing boundaries at a hyperlocal level, it nets out really to 50 different neighborhoods with different neighborhood centers, different high streets, everything down to school catchment areas. And what I've been doing is going into each of those neighborhoods and asking, okay, here's a map of your neighborhood. If we need to add 500, 1,000 new dwelling units in this neighborhood over the next decade, how do we do that? Where do we put them? What kind of housing typologies? What is the effect of this density on transit? Because density without transit is just dense. And what about schools? Are there going to be kids there? Or what about community centers? What about parks? We need our green space for our physical and mental health. And again, where do we shop? Where do we work? What is the impact? That's why we have a profession of planning in the first place. It's not just playing, whack-a-mole with zoning, spot rezoning, which is what's been going on in the city. So my overarching point is that it is incumbent on us as representatives of the people of Vancouver to ensure that the manner in which we plan for the future takes this into consideration, that we should be planning for livability, which should be managed with an appreciation of pace of change.
So you talked about affordability, and that's a key point. Especially, I'm a renter, and that's a big problem for renters. Affordability and the security of tenure, because most renters, the majority of renters in Vancouver, have no security, and that's something that you have spoken about in the past. Can you say something about that?
Well, particularly now, I mean, the land is the meat, and there are predators that are circling. Let's be real. We see all of the land assembly signs everywhere. I find it paradoxical that people are saying, "Oh, well, there's stonewalling about development." On council, there were 156 rezoning applications, 100% of which were approved. And I've tried to, shine a light on what's really going on. And then I get chastised for, having the temerity to actually stand up and say something's wrong with this picture. But what it's done is it's created a real feeding frenzy for developers to be looking at particularly affordable purpose-built rental. And what that means is apartment buildings, 3-story walk-ups, They come in a range of sizes. They can be small ones with, just 8 units or 10 units, or they can go up from there. But what we're seeing happening, we're seeing a variety of things happening. One is that they've actually determined that it's better to let people move out and leave the suites empty than bring in new tenants, because then they'd have to relocate them and manage that, which is problematic for developers. Or they will have people move out and then they'll double the rent for the next crowd that comes in. And so again, it's a persistent inflationary model, which is forcing people out of the city. And, again, as a long-term renter, I can appreciate the uncertainty and vulnerability that comes with that. And I got 2 kids in their 30s that are going through exactly the same thing. I've got one daughter living in the West End in one of the old 70s high rises, where she's been since graduating. And now, it's okay, we have to be grown-ups now. We have to move out and get our own apartment, and can't find anything for even double what she's paying now. And this will continue to be the pattern if our policies are putting out fire with gasoline, which they are.
I remember in 2018, I met you at an anti-demo eviction rally in the West End. And
everything we said was going to happen did.
You're in council. What have you done to protect renters? And if you become mayor, what will you do going forward?
Well, going forward, particularly because of the damage that's already been done with the Broadway plan, is we're looking at needing to implement vacancy control. And I should be clear that this is not intended to hit the little guys, the fewer than 6 units, the basement suites, the rooming houses, the duplexes. It's really the purpose-built rental apartment buildings that we're most concerned about. And, I'll put a caveat in that I want to do this on at least a 2-year basis so that we can see the impact. And we will have a review panel, because my experience with even things like empty homes tax and these kinds of changes in policy is that sometimes you can get people that get caught in the middle, and they're not your targets. The ones that are the targets are the ones that are abusing the system. And so we will put vacancy control in to ensure that we can protect people as we figure this out. But for me, it all starts with the dirt. You may have heard this from Patrick Condon as well. We've got to get the land inflation rates under control. We've got to reduce the cost that is attributable to the city and housing production, so that the smaller developers can afford to build the housing that we need within existing zone capacity. We need to stop the displacement of renters through vacancy control. And you may have heard that we're also looking at developing up to 2,000 units on city-owned land. And this is actually really important and really realistic, because the city has, through the Property Endowment Fund, properties that have as their mandate to generate land rent. I mean, that's the purpose in perpetuity of city-owned lands as a legacy. But if we can build 2,000 co-ops for a social mix of a third, and a third between low, medium, and high income levels, we can really set a pattern of affordability in the city. Co-ops are ideal for that. Moreover, just as was done back in the 70s by my father and the original team when Art Phillips was mayor, with Falls Creek South and then with Champlain Heights, not only did they do the third and a third and a third between the income levels, so too did they do that with the sources of funding between the city, the province, and the federal government. Now, recently, David Eby spoke of a $500 million fund at the provincial level. So if we can do 500, he can do 500, and then we have to hold the Fed's feet to the fire. because they are the ones that pulled the plug on building affordable rental housing and other forms of housing back in 1992, I believe it was. And if they can lend $1.4 billion to Ian Gillespie and Westbank and the Squamish to build Sanok, surely they can come up with $500 million to help build affordable co-op housing in the city of Vancouver.
So that leads us to the next question. One major criticism you've had is that about Sanok. Your people have called you various things that I'm not going to repeat here. But do you want to say something about that?
Well, again, the only thing I said was that I thought it was inappropriate to be taking parkland away that does not belong to the Sanok ceded. This was ceded land on the park that is being taken away from public use. That was what I was objecting to. I don't object to Squamish being able to maximize their profit from developing that 10.5 acres. I would just suggest that they should be thinking about livability in balance and also neighborliness, because we should, again, as a basic principle, that when we're developing land, we need to be conscious and mindful of our neighbors and not to even consult with the people that live here now that are going to be affected. I do take exception with that. It's 2022. We are living in the here and now as much as we are respectful and acknowledge historical injustices. But that doesn't mean we act in an unjust way to the people that live here now. And so this is one of the reasons why TEAM is a voice for all neighborhoods. We believe, in what we've put together are people that live across the whole of the city. We're trying to be representative, gender balanced, racially and demographically diverse, politically diverse. We're trying to represent the people of the city. And when we look at developments, especially large ones, and that would be true of First Nations developers as opposed to any developer, it's still incumbent on them to consult with the people that will be affected. And that's the bottom line for me. I don't begrudge your ability to develop, but does that mean that you just disregard everybody around you? I don't think that's appropriate.
So finally, this is something I ask of all candidates. I'm a renter. I have a 3.5-year-old. So give me your 90-second pitch. Why should I vote for Colleen Hardwick?
Well, because for you and my kids that have 3-year-olds and babies, I am 100% committed to getting to the bottom of affordability in the city. If we continue down the same path, we're all going to be forced out. My kids are talking about Nanaimo. So I've analyzed it. This is not hyperbole. We need to get inflation under control. We need to get the costs that the city controls under control. And we need to use city land and resources to build affordable co-op housing. And then with respect very specifically to renters, we need to implement vacancy controls until we're able to get ourselves into balance or recover our balance as a city. And I keep coming back to the word balance because we are out of balance. And we can do this if we really think about it and are committed to making it work.
Okay, thank you so much, Colleen, for taking time out of your busy day to talk to me today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Rohana. Keep up the good work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye now.